The Wyoming wind was sharp that night, a howling reminder that winter on the frontier did not forgive the weak or the unprepared. Snow drifted through the cracks of the old Cheyenne train station, gathering in corners and seeping under the boots of weary travelers who clutched their coats tight against the cold. Lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across benches where men hunched in silence, their breath misting in the air. Among them sat a woman, not yet 30, though hardship had already carved its quiet lines into her face. Her dress was worn, her gloves too thin, and the wool scarf around her shoulders could do little against the biting cold. She hugged a small carpetbag to her chest as if it were both shield and lifeline. Her name was Elizabeth Montgomery, though those who would come to know her would simply call her Libby. Libby's story was already one of loss. She had been a nurse in Chicago, working long hours in hospitals where coal smoke mixed with sickness. She had chosen her profession not for money but for the calling of it, for the chance to mend, to ease suffering, to be useful. But usefulness was rarely enough for a woman in those days. One refusal to look away when a powerful doctor's hands lingered where they shouldn't had cost her everything. By morning, rumors had spread like wildfire. Libby was accused of misconduct, of dishonor, of impropriety no respectable institution could tolerate. She was dismissed without so much as a chance to speak. With her reputation stained and her savings dwindling, she bought a one-way ticket west. She had no destination, no family waiting, only a stubborn hope that the frontier might offer her a chance the city never would. Now, as the blizzard raged outside and the night grew colder, that hope seemed fragile. Each breath felt heavier, her body trembling with exhaustion, her future as uncertain as the storm. It was then that the doors to the station swung wide, and a rush of icy air swept through the room. Heads turned, but it wasn't the wind that caught their attention. It was the man who stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a dusting of snow across his hat and coat, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who feared nothing, not the weather, not the stares of strangers, not the weight of expectation. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he removed his gloves, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was no ordinary cowboy, though at first glance one might mistake him for such. His name was Jackson Thornton, and though he had worked cattle and mended fences like any ranch hand, he was far from poor. In fact, by the standards of the frontier, Jackson was a millionaire. His family ranch, the Double T, stretched across thousands of acres of Wyoming land, a legacy built with grit, sweat, and a fair share of luck. But wealth had never made Jackson careless. He still rode the range, still swung a lariat, still bore the scars of broken horses and winter storms. Money had only given him options, and one of those options was to choose the kind of man he wanted to be. That night, as his gaze fell on Libby shivering on the bench, clutching her bag like a drowning woman might cling to driftwood, Jackson made a choice that would change both their lives. He walked toward her, his spurs faintly jingling, his shadow stretching long under the flickering lantern light. She noticed him first by the sound, then by the sudden warmth of presence that seemed to cut through the cold. For a moment, she stiffened, wary. In her experience, men often approached with expectations, not kindness. "Miss," Jackson said gently, tipping his hat. His voice was deep, steady, carrying a hint of the South though worn by years in the West. "You look like you've been sittin' here a spell too long. You got somewhere to go tonight?" Libby swallowed, her lips dry, her voice nearly lost in the chill. "Nowhere," she admitted softly. Jackson studied her, noticing the pallor of her skin, the way her fingers trembled despite the bag clutched tight. She was freezing, likely hungry, and clearly alone. Something stirred in him, part instinct, part compassion, part the unshakable sense that fate had placed her here at this exact moment. "Then you'll come with me," he said simply. Her eyes widened. I can't. You don't even know me." Jackson's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "No, I don't. But I know what cold like this can do to a body. And I ain't about to leave a woman to freeze in a train station when I've got a fire burnin' not 10 minutes from here." She hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. But when a shiver racked her body so violently she could barely breathe, she gave the smallest of nods. Jackson removed his coat, heavy and lined with fur, and draped it around her shoulders. She sank into its warmth, the scent of leather and smoke surrounding her. For the first time that night, she felt the possibility of safety. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. Together they stepped out into the storm, the snow swirling around them as if trying to erase their footprints. Jackson guided her to a waiting sleigh hitched to a pair of sturdy horses, their breath steaming in the night. He lifted her gently into the seat, tucked blankets around her, and took the reins. The ride to the ranch was silent but not empty. Libby stole glances at the man beside her, wondering why a stranger of means would bother with someone like her. Jackson, for his part, kept his eyes on the storm, though he felt the weight of her presence like a spark catching tinder. By the time they reached the Double T, the snow had eased. Lanterns glowed from the big house on the hill, its windows shining like beacons in the dark. Jackson helped Libby inside, where warmth and the smell of burning wood welcomed her. She stood uncertainly in the entryway, her hands clutching the coat around her. "Rest easy," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Libby believed him. That night, as she lay under quilts in a room finer than any she had known, Libby whispered a prayer of gratitude into the darkness. She had no way of knowing that this act of kindness, born of a storm and a stranger's compassion, would ignite a love story that would be remembered long after both their names had faded into history. Morning broke over the Thornton Ranch with a pale glow, the sun fighting its way through lingering clouds left behind by the storm. The snow lay heavy on the fences and rooftops, a white blanket muffling the usual clamor of ranch life. Yet inside the big house, the air was warm with the scent of biscuits baking and coffee brewing. Libby stirred beneath the quilts, unsure for a moment where she was. The mattress beneath her was soft, the linens clean, the room spacious. Sunlight slipped through lace curtains, casting golden patches on the wooden floor. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, she felt the stillness of safety. But with safety came unease. She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Her carpetbag sat on the chair where she'd placed it last night, a pitiful reminder of all she had left. She thought of Chicago, the sterile hospital halls, the whispers that ruined her name, the cold faces that turned away. She had crossed miles to escape, yet she could not leave behind the truth: she was alone, and her future uncertain. A knock at the door startled her. Before she could answer, it opened just enough for Jackson Thornton to step inside. He removed his hat out of habit, holding it against his chest. "Good mornin', Miss Montgomery," he said, his deep voice carrying a kind of respectful warmth. "I trust you slept well." Libby hesitated before nodding. "Better than I have in some time. Thank you, for your kindness." Jackson gave a small smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. "No thanks needed. Storm like that, anyone would have done the same." But she doubted that. Most men in his position might have turned a blind eye, or worse. There was something different about Jackson, though she couldn't quite place it. "I won't trouble you long," she said quickly, clutching the quilt tighter. "I'll be on the next train out." His brow furrowed. "And where exactly would that train be taking you?" Her silence was answer enough. She had nowhere. No job, no kin, no destination beyond the vague hope that somewhere west of Chicago lay a place she could start again. Jackson stepped further into the room, careful not to crowd her. "This is a big ranch, Miss Montgomery. 50 hands, cattle spread from here to the hills, and work enough to tire any man. We could use someone with skills like yours. Injuries are common out here, and truth be told, we've been needin' a proper nurse." Her eyes lifted in surprise. "You'd offer me a position? Just like that?" He shrugged lightly. "I ain't one to waste good talent, and I know determination when I see it. You wouldn't have come this far if you didn't have grit." Libby lowered her gaze, torn between disbelief and cautious hope. To be needed again, to serve, to heal, was more than she had dared dream. But trust did not come easily anymore. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Jackson's voice softened. "Then let me work here a while. See if it suits. If not, the train will still be waitin' when you're ready." The offer lingered between them like a fragile flame. At last, Libby gave a slow nod. "All right." That day marked the beginning of a new chapter. By mid-morning, Libby was introduced to the ranch hands, rough men hardened by years of cattle drives and prairie storms. At first, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. What use was a woman, a nurse no less, on a working ranch? But skepticism gave way to necessity soon enough. Within hours, a young cowboy limped into the bunkhouse, a nasty gash across his leg from barbed wire. Libby set to work with practiced hands, her movements swift and sure. She cleaned the wound, stitched it neatly, and wrapped it with fresh bandages, all while the cowboy, wide-eyed with nerves, marveled at her calm. Word spread quickly, the new nurse knew her craft. By evening, the men who had doubted her were singing her praises over supper. Jackson watched from across the table, pride flickering in his eyes. She had earned their respect in a single day. But respect did not erase loneliness. That night, as Libby returned to the quiet room Jackson had given her, she found herself staring out the window at the vast Wyoming sky. Stars glittered like diamonds against the black. She thought of the life she had left behind, of the betrayal that had driven her here. Could this place truly become her home? Downstairs, Jackson sat by the fire, his mind restless. He had brought her in from the storm out of compassion, but already he felt something stirring beyond duty. Libby was unlike any woman he had known, strong without being hard, gentle without being meek. She carried her pain like a weight she refused to set down, yet in her eyes he saw the spark of resilience. The days turned into weeks. Libby threw herself into work, tending to ranch hands with cuts, bruises, and the occasional broken bone. She organized supplies, taught basic hygiene, and insisted on cleanliness the men had long neglected. Slowly, she carved a place for herself, not as a charity case but as an indispensable member of the ranch. Jackson watched her with quiet admiration. He respected her independence, never pressing, never overstepping. Yet each shared meal, each accidental brush of hands, each stolen glance in passing built a bond neither could ignore. One evening, as spring thaw began to melt the snow, Jackson found her in the barn tending to a calf born weak. She cradled the small creature with such tenderness that he felt his heart shift. "You've got a way about you," he said softly, leaning against the stall. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's nothing. Just a creature in need." "Funny," Jackson replied, his voice low. "That's what I thought when I found you at that train station." The words hung in the air, unspoken truths woven into the silence. Libby felt her cheeks warm, her pulse quicken. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the ranch bell clanged outside, calling the men to an urgent roundup. The moment passed, but the feeling lingered. Spring brought challenges of its own, cattle drives, storms, and disputes with neighboring ranchers. Through it all, Libby remained steadfast. Her reputation as the Angel of the Double T grew, not only among the hands but across nearby towns. Mothers brought their children to her, farmers their injuries, travelers their ailments. Jackson made sure she had the resources she needed, even building her a small infirmary near the main house. It was during one of these busy days that word reached Chicago. The disgraced nurse thought lost to scandal was thriving in Wyoming, respected and cherished. And with that news came trouble that would soon test the bond between Libby and Jackson in ways neither could have foreseen. For fate has a way of stirring storms long after the skies have cleared. The trouble arrived in Cheyenne on the noon train, wrapped in fine coats and sharper intentions. Dr. Harrison, the very man whose lies had destroyed Libby's career in Chicago, stepped onto the platform with the air of someone who believed the world owed him deference. Behind him trailed two associates, men more accustomed to paperwork than prairie dust, but each carried the arrogance of authority. Harrison had not expected Elizabeth Montgomery to survive her fall from grace, let alone thrive. In his mind, she had been ruined, cast aside, erased. But rumors traveled fast, even faster when carried by newspapers hungry for scandal. And when word reached him that the disgraced nurse was not only alive but celebrated in Wyoming, he saw not redemption for her but a threat to himself. At the Thornton Ranch, life continued in its steady rhythm. Jackson rode the range by day, overseeing calving season, while Libby managed her growing responsibilities in the infirmary. Though busy, they found moments, quiet breakfasts before dawn, brief walks under starlit skies, the rare shared laugh that felt like stolen treasure. It was on such an evening, as the lanterns burned low and the men sang softly outside, that a rider approached with urgent news. "Mr. Thornton," the rider called, breathless. "There's men in town askin' after Miss Montgomery." Said their names was Harrison. Libby froze, her hands tightening around the apron she wore. Color drained from her face. Jackson saw it immediately. "You know, Em." Her voice trembled. "Too well. Dr. Harrison was the man who destroyed me." Jackson's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "Then he won't find you undefended here." But Harrison did not come with fists. He came with papers, claims of impropriety, accusations that he carried like weapons. The very next day, a summons arrived from the territorial court in Cheyenne. Libby was to appear, accused once more of misconduct, her reputation dragged into question before strangers. The weight of it crushed her. She had built something here, respect, purpose, the beginnings of a home. And now the past had come to rip it away. "I can't fight him," she whispered, sitting in the quiet of the infirmary. "I tried once. No one believed me." Jackson knelt beside her, his calloused hand covering hers. "You're not alone this time. You've got me. You've got every man on this ranch who's been stitched back together by your hands. You've got mothers who trust you with their children, neighbors who walk miles for your help. You've earned something no liar can take." She looked at him, tears threatening. "But what if it's not enough?" His eyes held hers, steady and unyielding. "Then we'll make it enough." The trial in Cheyenne drew crowds, for nothing stirred curiosity like scandal. The courtroom was packed, whispers darting like sparks among the benches. Harrison stood tall, his voice oily as he spun his tale of a nurse who had behaved improperly, who had shamed her profession. His words dripped with conviction, rehearsed and poisonous. Libby, sitting at the defense table, felt the same cold dread that had silenced her once before. But when the judge called for testimony, a figure rose from the back, broad-shouldered, steady, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Jackson Thornton stepped forward. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the weight of honesty born from a life lived plain. "This woman you're hearin' lies about. She saved the lives of more men than I can count. She stitched them up when they were torn open, set their bones, calmed their fears. She's the reason half my ranch hands are walkin' today. And I'll swear before God and man, there ain't a dishonest bone in her body." One by one, others stood. Cowboys, townsfolk, mothers clutching children, each told their story. The boy whose fever she'd broken, the rancher whose arm she'd mended, the newborn she'd delivered in the dead of night. The courtroom, once thick with suspicion, filled with voices of truth. Harrison sputtered, his arguments unraveling under the sheer weight of testimony. When Libby finally rose to speak, her voice was clear, her gaze unwavering. "I have nothing to hide. I chose to stand against a man who thought his power greater than my dignity. I paid the price for it, but I will not bow to lies again." By the trial's end, the verdict was unanimous. The charges were dismissed. Harrison's reputation, not Libby's, lay in tatters. He stormed from the courtroom, humiliated, while townsfolk gathered around Libby, offering hands, words, and gratitude. Outside, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, Jackson found her. Relief washed through him as he saw the strength in her eyes, the fire that had nearly been extinguished now burning brighter than ever. "You faced him down," he said softly. "No," she replied, her hand finding his. "We faced him down." Their bond, forged in storm and trial, grew deeper in that moment. For Libby, the past had lost its chains. For Jackson, the future had gained its promise. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a quiet peace. Libby sat beside Jackson in the wagon, the wind tugging at her hair, the sun dipping low on the horizon. She thought of the night he had found her freezing in the station, of the coat he had draped over her shoulders, of the words he had spoken, "You're safe now." For the first time, she believed not only in her safety but in her belonging. This land, this ranch, this man, it was more than refuge. It was home. But the frontier was never content to leave lives untested. Just as storms return with each season, so too would new trials rise. And love, no matter how deep, would be forced to prove itself in fire and sacrifice before it could write its place in history. The weeks after the trial brought a quiet kind of celebration to the Double T Ranch. Life returned to its rhythms, calves were branded, fences mended, horses broken, but everything felt different. Libby was no longer the woman who had arrived half-frozen at a train station. She was the heart of the ranch now, a figure respected, even cherished, by all who lived and worked there. Jackson noticed it most in the way the men spoke her name. Once strangers had called her, "that nurse," but now they called her, "Miss Libby," with a reverence reserved for someone who had earned her place. She had healed more than wounds, she had healed skepticism itself. Still, Libby carried within her a humility that made her kindness shine brighter. She refused to be placed on a pedestal. To her, every life she touched was a reminder of why she had chosen her calling. She was not saving the frontier, she was serving it. And in serving, she found herself whole again. One evening, as summer painted the hills in gold and green, Jackson asked her to ride with him. They saddled 2 horses and set out across the range, the air warm, the sky wide and endless. For a time, they rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves. At last, Jackson reined in atop a ridge that overlooked the valley. The Double T stretched below them, herds grazing in the fading light, the river cutting silver through the land. He removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair as if steadying himself. "This ranch," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "it's my family's legacy. My father built it from near nothing, and I've spent my life holding it together. But land and cattle don't mean much without someone to share it with." Libby turned toward him, her breath catching as she saw the raw honesty in his eyes. "Elizabeth Montgomery," Jackson continued, his voice deep but unsteady, "I've watched you mend broken bones and broken spirits alike. I've seen you face down lies with truth and fear with courage. And somewhere along the way, I realized this place, this life, it won't ever be complete without you in it. I'm a skin, you, plain as a man can, will you marry me?" The words hung in the evening air, weighty yet tender. Libby felt her heart race, her mind flashing through every hardship she had endured to reach this moment. She thought of the cold station where he had found her, the trial where he had defended her, the countless quiet moments where his presence had steadied her soul. Her eyes shimmered with tears, but her voice was steady. "Yes, Jackson. Yes, I will." Relief and joy broke across his face as he leaned forward, taking her hand in his calloused one. The kiss they shared was gentle, yet it carried the strength of all they had endured and the promise of all that lay ahead. News of their engagement spread quickly. The ranch hands cheered, neighbors offered congratulations, and the small town nearby buzzed with anticipation. A wedding at the Double T was no small affair, especially when the bride and groom carried a story already becoming legend. Preparations began, and Libby found herself swept into a whirlwind of plans she had never imagined. Dresses were sewn, flowers chosen, food prepared. Yet amid the bustle, she insisted on simplicity. "I don't need finery," she told Jackson. "All I need is you, and a place where vows can be spoken true." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect canvas of blue. Guests arrived from miles around, ranchers, townsfolk, even travelers who had heard whispers of the nurse and the millionaire cowboy. The ceremony was held outdoors beneath a great oak tree, its branches heavy with blossoms. Libby wore a dress of ivory, modest yet radiant. Jackson stood tall beside her, his suit plain but his eyes filled with devotion. As the preacher spoke, the crowd grew silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant call of meadowlarks. When it came time for vows, Jackson's voice rang steady. "I promise to stand by you through storm and sun alike. To honor the strength you've shown, to share in the burdens you carry, and to build a life worthy of the love you've given me." Libby's reply was soft yet firm, carrying across the gathered crowd. "I promise to walk beside you, to heal where I can, to comfort where I must, and to cherish this life we build together, no matter what trials may come." Their kiss sealed not only their vows but a story that would be retold for years. Applause rose, mingled with tears and laughter. The celebration stretched long into the evening, music, dancing, tables laden with food, children running beneath lanterns strung between trees. For Jackson, it was a dream fulfilled. For Libby, it was a redemption made real. Together, they were no longer fragments of broken pasts but builders of a shared future. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect canvas of blue. Guests arrived from miles around, ranchers, townsfolk, even travelers who had heard whispers of the nurse and the millionaire cowboy. The ceremony was held outdoors beneath a great oak tree, its branches heavy with blossoms. Libby wore a dress of ivory, modest yet radiant. Jackson stood tall beside her, his suit plain but his eyes filled with devotion. As the preacher spoke, the crowd grew silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant call of meadowlarks. When it came time for vows, Jackson's voice rang steady. "I promise to stand by you through storm and sun alike. To honor the strength you've shown, to share in the burdens you carry, and to build a life worthy of the love you've given me." Libby's reply was soft yet firm, carrying across the gathered crowd. "I promise to walk beside you, to heal where I can, to comfort where I must, and to cherish this life we build together, no matter what trials may come." Their kiss sealed not only their vows but a story that would be retold for years. Applause rose, mingled with tears and laughter. The celebration stretched long into the evening, music, dancing, tables laden with food, children running beneath lanterns strung between trees. For Jackson, it was a dream fulfilled. For Libby, it was a redemption made real. Together, they were no longer fragments of broken pasts but builders of a shared future. As the festivities wound down and the stars shimmered overhead, Jackson and Libby slipped away to the quiet of the porch. They sat side by side, the murmur of laughter drifting from the yard, the crickets singing in the grass. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," Libby whispered, her hand entwined with his. Jackson shook his head gently. "No, Libby. You've given me more than wealth or land ever could. You've given me a reason for it all to matter." The night embraced them, and for a time, the world felt still. But even as joy filled their hearts, neither could know the challenges that awaited, droughts that would test the ranch, losses that would scar their spirits, and triumphs that would make their love not just a story of two hearts, but a tale of endurance that belonged to the West itself. Married life at the Double T began not with luxury, but with labor. Jackson and Libby had no illusions that their vows would shield them from hardship. In fact, it seemed the land itself tested them from the very start. The summer after their wedding was one of the driest Wyoming had seen in decades. Grass grew thin on the hillsides, rivers shrank to sluggish trickles, and dust clung to every boot and wagon wheel. The cattle grew lean, and the ranch hands worked tirelessly to drive the herds to what little pasture remained. Libby quickly learned that being mistress of the ranch meant more than tending the infirmary. She rose before dawn, managing supplies, preparing meals for exhausted hands, and walking the dry pastures with Jackson to check for signs of sickness among the herd. Each day ended with aching muscles and dust in her hair, but she never complained. This was her life now, and she embraced it with the same grit that had carried her through blizzards and trials. Jackson watched her with admiration. He had known wealth in the form of land and cattle, but never had he known the wealth of partnership. Libby matched him stride for stride, her strength unshaken even when her body faltered. More than once, he returned from the range to find her asleep at the infirmary table, her head resting on folded arms, a lantern burning low beside her. He would cover her with a blanket, a quiet smile on his face, before letting her rest. The drought worsened, and with it came fire. One late afternoon, smoke rose on the horizon, dark and ominous. Flames swept across the prairie faster than a horse could gallop, devouring grass and fence posts, threatening to consume everything in its path. The ranch hands mounted in haste, driving the cattle toward the river while Jackson shouted orders above the roar of the wind. Libby worked alongside them, hauling water, tending burns, and calming panicked animals. The fire raged through the night, but by dawn, it was beaten back, barely. Acres of pasture were scorched, but the house stood, and most of the herd survived. Exhausted and soot-stained, Libby collapsed onto the porch steps as Jackson sat beside her. His arm went around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You've got more grit than any cowboy I know," he said with a tired chuckle. She leaned against him, her eyes heavy but determined. "This land may test us, Jackson, but it won't break us." Her words became their creed. The following winter brought its own challenges. Blizzards buried the ranch in snow, and food grew scarce. Yet even in hardship, there was joy. In the small hours of a bitter January night, Libby gave birth to their first child, a daughter with eyes as clear as the Wyoming sky. They named her Clara, and her arrival lit the ranch with a warmth no storm could diminish. Libby proved as natural a mother as she was a nurse, balancing care for her daughter with her duties to the ranch. Jackson, though often weary from the demands of cattle and land, found renewed strength in fatherhood. He would hold Clara in his arms after long days, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around his calloused ones. Word spread beyond the valley of the love story unfolding at the Double T. Travelers passing through told tales of the millionaire cowboy and the nurse who had become his wife, of their struggles and triumphs, of the way their union seemed to embody the very spirit of the frontier. Newspapers picked up the story, embellishing details, turning them into legends before their time. Yet for Jackson and Libby, life was no legend. It was early mornings, endless work, and quiet evenings by the fire. It was laughter and exhaustion, joy and grief interwoven like threads in a single cloth. Grief came when sickness struck the ranch in the spring of their third year. A fever swept through the bunkhouse, felling strong men in days. Libby fought tirelessly, tending the sick, mixing remedies, refusing to rest. But even her skill could not save them all. 3 men were buried on the hill overlooking the valley, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses. Libby wept that night, her shoulders shaking as Jackson held her. "I should have done more," she whispered. "You did all anyone could," he murmured. "You gave them comfort when they needed it most. That's more than most men will ever know." Her sorrow weighed heavy, but it did not crush her. She rose the next morning and returned to her work, stronger for the loss she carried. The years rolled on, marked by trials and triumphs alike. Another child was born, a son they named William, sturdy and spirited. The ranch expanded, fences pushed farther into the hills, herds grew, and with them the demands of leadership. Jackson and Libby faced disputes with neighbors, rustlers on the range, storms that toppled barns and scattered cattle. Through it all, they stood side by side, never wavering. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of fire, Jackson and Libby walked the ridge where he had first asked her to marry him. Clara, now a lively toddler, ran ahead, her laughter ringing through the air. Jackson took Libby's hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding band. "When I first found you at that station, I never imagined we'd be standin' here," with land beneath our feet and children at our side." Libby smiled, her eyes glistening as she watched Clara chase fireflies. "Neither did I. But maybe that's the beauty of it, Jackson. We weren't meant to imagine it. We were meant to live it." The wind stirred the grass around them, carrying with it the scent of earth, the promise of seasons yet to come. Together, they stood, their hearts bound not only by love but by the land that tested and shaped them. And though the world would one day remember their names as legend, for them it was simply life, hard, beautiful, and worth every breath. By the time Clara turned 5, the Double T had grown into more than just a ranch. Under Jackson's steady leadership and Libby's guiding presence, it had become a community. Families settled on nearby plots, drawn by the promise of work and stability. A schoolhouse was built with logs hauled from the mountains, its bell ringing each morning to call children from miles around. Libby took a special interest in the school. Though her days were filled with nursing and caring for her own children, she found time to teach lessons on hygiene, basic health, and compassion. To her, knowledge was as important as medicine, and she believed the frontier's future depended on more than strong backs, it depended on minds that understood care and responsibility. Jackson admired her vision. He often said the ranch might be his legacy, but the school and infirmary would be hers. Together, they dreamed not only of survival but of a community that could thrive in the harsh West. But dreams seldom went unchallenged. The wealth and success of the Double T drew attention, some admiring, some envious, and some dangerous. It began with small thefts, a few head of cattle missing, a wagon load of supplies stolen in the night. At first, Jackson dismissed it as the work of desperate men. But when armed riders began harassing the ranch hands on the range, he knew it was more than desperation. Rustlers had set their sights on the Double T. The tension weighed heavy on the ranch. Men rode armed, watchfires were kept through the night, and every creak of the barn or howl of a coyote set nerves on edge. Through it all, Libby remained a calm presence, tending wounds, offering steady words, refusing to let fear rule their lives. One night, the danger struck close. Jackson was returning from checking fence lines when gunfire split the air. Bullets whizzed past him, splintering wood, throwing sparks off stone. He spurred his horse hard, returning fire as he raced toward the house. By the time he reached safety, the attackers had vanished into the dark, leaving behind only the echo of their threat. Libby met him at the door, lantern in hand, her face pale but composed. "You're hurt," she said, seeing the blood on his arm. "Just a graze," he muttered, though the pain was sharp. She drew him inside, cleaning and stitching the wound with practiced hands. Her fingers trembled only once, when she whispered, "I can't lose you, Jackson. Not to men like that." He caught her wrist gently, his gaze steady. "You won't. I swear it." But he knew the fight was far from over. In the weeks that followed, Jackson rallied the ranch hands, organizing patrols and tightening defenses. Neighbors joined in, recognizing that if the Double T fell, no ranch in the valley was safe. Together, they formed a posse, riding out under the moonlight to track the rustlers. It was a long chase, stretching across rivers and hills, but at last they cornered the gang in a canyon. A fierce gunfight erupted, echoing off the stone walls. Jackson fought at the front, his rifle steady, his voice commanding. By dawn, the rustlers were routed, their leader captured and taken to Cheyenne for trial. When Jackson returned home, weary and dust-covered, Libby met him at the gate. Relief flooded her face as she wrapped her arms around him. "You kept your word," she whispered. "I told you," he replied, holding her close. "This land, this life, we'll defend it together." The victory restored peace, but it also strengthened the bond between them. They had faced storms, fire, disease, and now violence, yet each trial had only drawn them closer. Their love was no fragile thing, it was iron, forged in hardship, unbreakable. As the years passed, their family grew. William learned to ride before he could properly run, his laughter echoing across the pastures. Clara developed her mother's gentle touch, often helping Libby in the infirmary, her small hands eager to learn. A third child was born, a boy they named Samuel, whose curious eyes seemed always to search the horizon. Together, the Thornton children thrived in the rugged beauty of Wyoming. They learned not only to endure the land but to respect it, to see it not as enemy but as partner. And always, they carried with them the example of their parents, Jackson's strength, Libby's compassion, both bound by a love that seemed as vast and enduring as the plains themselves. Yet even as the Thornton family flourished, Libby could not shake a quiet awareness: life on the frontier was fragile. Every joy was shadowed by the possibility of loss. She had seen too many lives cut short, too many dreams buried beneath simple wooden crosses. And so, each day, she cherished what she had, knowing tomorrow could bring change. One evening, as autumn leaves turned the hillsides gold, Libby stood on the porch watching the sunset. Jackson joined her, his arm slipping around her waist. Together they looked out at the land they had fought for, the home they had built. "We've come far, haven't we?" Libby murmured. "Farther than I ever dreamed," Jackson replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think people will remember us, Jackson? Years from now, when we're gone?" He was silent for a long moment, then said softly, "Maybe. But it don't matter. What matters is the life we've lived, the love we've shared. That's our real legacy." Libby smiled, her heart full. She knew he was right. Their story was not about fame or legend, though others might tell it that way. It was about endurance, faith, and the quiet triumph of choosing love again and again, no matter the trials. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and shadow, Libby knew that whatever lay ahead, whether joy or sorrow, peace or struggle, they would face it as they always had, together. The Thornton children grew quickly, as children always do, their laughter filling the halls of the ranch house and their energy spilling out onto the open plains. Clara, at 10 years old, had a grace about her that reminded everyone of her mother. She shadowed Libby constantly, watching how she mixed remedies, changed bandages, and soothed both patients and worried families. William, only 8, carried his father's fire, restless, bold, and never without a scrape or bruise from his adventures. Samuel, the youngest, was just beginning to walk, his tiny steps bringing endless delight to all who watched him toddle across the floor. The ranch was thriving. After years of struggle, the herds had multiplied, the fields were fertile, and the community around the Double T was strong. The schoolhouse bell rang each morning, the church pews filled on Sundays, and the infirmary that Libby ran had become known across the territory. Jackson often joked that while cattle put food on the table, it was Libby who had given the Double T its true name, a place of healing, not just living. But even in times of prosperity, the frontier was never predictable. In the summer of Clara's 11th year, a sickness swept through the valley. It began with a cough, then fever, then a weakness that left even the strongest men bedridden. Families whispered the word influenza, a disease that had claimed too many lives in other parts of the country. Fear spread faster than the sickness itself. Libby did not flinch. She threw herself into the battle, tending to the sick day and night, rarely sleeping, barely eating. Jackson begged her to rest, but she shook her head. "If I stop, more will die," she said simply. The infirmary overflowed. Beds were filled with coughing, shivering bodies, and still more arrived each day. Libby taught the ranch hands to brew teas, mix poultices, and keep the sick warm and hydrated. Clara joined her, carrying water, wiping brows, learning more in a single month than most children her age could imagine. But the sickness did not spare the Thornton household. One morning, Libby awoke to find William flushed with fever, his small body trembling. Her heart clenched as she gathered him into her arms, knowing too well the danger. For 3 days and nights, she and Jackson sat at his bedside. Libby mixed every remedy she knew, while Jackson whispered encouragement, holding his son's hand through the fever's grip. Clara watched over Samuel, keeping her little brother safe as the storm raged around them. On the fourth morning, when William's fever finally broke and his breathing eased, Libby wept tears of relief against Jackson's chest. They had nearly lost him, but he had pulled through. Many in the valley were not so fortunate. Graves were dug on windswept hillsides, and families mourned. Yet through Libby's tireless care, more lives were saved than lost. Her name spread even farther, spoken with reverence as the Angel of the Double T. When at last the sickness passed, the valley held a gathering to honor her. Families came with food, ranchers with gifts, children with flowers. Jackson watched with pride as Libby, humbled and blushing, accepted their thanks. He knew she would never see herself as anything more than a servant of her calling, but to him, and to all of them, she was the heart of their world. That night, after the children were asleep, Jackson sat with her on the porch, the stars blazing bright above. He took her hand in his, rough and calloused against her slender fingers. "You saved them, Libby," he said quietly. Her gaze remained on the horizon. "I did what I could. But some I couldn't save." He turned her face toward him, his eyes steady. "That ain't failure. That's life. You gave them dignity, comfort, hope. That's more than most men ever get in this world." She leaned against him, weary but comforted. "Sometimes I wonder if I have the strength to keep going." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Then you'll lean on me. And when I grow weary, I'll lean on you. That's how we've made it this far." Years rolled on, carrying with them both joys and burdens. Clara blossomed into a young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's determination. William grew bold, skilled with horses and quick with a smile, though his mischief often tested their patience. Samuel, curious and thoughtful, seemed to carry an old soul in his small frame, asking questions that made even Jackson pause. Together, the family faced droughts, harsh winters, disputes with neighbors, and the ever-present challenges of ranch life. Yet their bond only deepened. Love was not a fleeting romance but a daily choice, a steady flame that burned brighter with each storm endured. As Libby and Jackson grew older, whispers of their story spread far beyond Wyoming. Travelers repeated it in saloons, newspapers published embellished versions, and soon their tale was told as if it were legend, the millionaire cowboy who had found a freezing nurse at a train station, and the love that had carried them through every trial. Sometimes Jackson laughed at the exaggerations. "They'll be sayin' I lassoed you right off that bench before long," he joked one evening. Libby smiled, her eyes warm. "Let them tell it how they will. We know the truth. And that's enough." But as the years slipped by, Libby began to feel the weight of time. The endless labor, the long nights, the sacrifices, all had left their mark. She tired more easily, her hands stiffened with age, her once quick steps slowing. Jackson noticed, though she tried to hide it. He would quietly take over her tasks, never making mention, only ensuring she had moments to rest. One evening, after a long day of work, he found her sitting alone in the infirmary, staring at the shelves lined with jars and bandages. "You all right, darlin'?" he asked. She nodded faintly, then whispered, "I wonder if I've done enough. If I've given enough." Jackson knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His voice was firm, filled with the same conviction that had once defended her in court. "Libby, you've given more than most could in 10 lifetimes. You've healed this valley. You've raised children who will carry your heart into the future. And you've loved me in a way I'll never deserve but will always be grateful for. That's more than enough." Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Then I suppose we've done well, haven't we?" He smiled softly. "Better than well. We've made history, Libby. Whether folks remember our names or not, we've lived a life worth remembering. And as the night deepened, with their children safe and their legacy secure, Libby knew that the story which had begun in the cold of a train station had become something eternal, a love not bound by wealth or circumstance, but by the unshakable choice to endure together. The Thornton children grew into their own paths, each one carrying forward a part of the love and grit that had built the Double T. Clara, at 16, had the steady presence of her mother. She often walked the range with Jackson, listening intently as he explained the land, the cattle, the sky. Yet when she returned to the house, she slipped seamlessly into Libby's world, mixing tinctures, reading medical texts, and helping with births in the valley. Neighbors began calling her Little Libby, a title that made her blush but filled her parents with quiet pride. William, now 14, was all fire and motion. He had his father's broad shoulders and restless spirit, his mother's quick wit and stubbornness. He rode horses fearlessly, drove cattle as though born to it, and dreamed of new ventures, expanding the ranch, trading with faraway towns, carving out his own mark on the world. Jackson saw himself in his son's boldness but also worried that recklessness might one day carry a heavy cost. Samuel, at 9, remained the thoughtful observer. He loved books more than horses, often sitting on the porch with a novel while his siblings dashed about. Yet when he did speak, his words carried weight. He noticed things others missed, the shift of clouds before a storm, the sorrow in a neighbor's eyes, the way his mother's hand sometimes trembled when she thought no one was looking. Together, they were the heart of the Thornton household, and Libby and Jackson often marveled at the life they had built. From that frozen night at the station to this bustling ranch filled with laughter and hope, their journey had been long, hard, and beautiful. But life, as always, carried new trials. In the spring of Clara's 17th year, a letter arrived from Chicago. It bore the seal of a medical college and was addressed to Miss Clara Thornton. With trembling hands, she opened it at the supper table, her family gathered around. The letter offered her a place at the college, a chance to study medicine formally, to become not only a nurse like her mother but a doctor. Libby's eyes shone with tears, pride radiating from her. Jackson smiled, though there was a shadow in his gaze, pride mixed with the ache of knowing his daughter's path might carry her far from home. That night, as Clara sat on the porch holding the letter, Libby joined her. "You remind me of myself at your age," she said softly. "Eager to serve, to heal. But you'll have chances I never had, Clara. You can go farther than me." Clara looked down, torn. "But what about the ranch? About you and Papa? About everyone here who needs help?" Libby placed a hand over her daughter's. "There will always be need. But this is your calling. And no matter how far you go, you'll carry this place with you. You'll carry us." The decision weighed heavy, but Clara chose to go. In the autumn, Jackson hitched the wagon and drove her to the train station, the very same where he had once found Libby shivering in the snow. This time, it was not a meeting of lost souls but a farewell filled with hope. Jackson's throat tightened as he helped Clara onto the platform. "You remember who you are, girl," he said gruffly. "You're a Thornton. Strong, steady, honest. Don't let the world make you doubt it." Clara hugged him fiercely. "I won't, Papa. I promise." As the train pulled away, Libby stood with tears on her cheeks, Samuel clutching her hand, William waving wildly. Jackson wrapped his arm around her shoulders, whispering, "We let her go so she can fly. That's what love does." Back at the ranch, the absence of Clara was felt in every corner. William tried to fill the gap, taking on more responsibility, but his reckless streak grew sharper. He wanted to prove himself, to show he could be more than the middle child in his sister's shadow. One day, in the midst of a cattle drive, his daring nearly cost him his life. Pushing his horse too hard, he attempted to cut off a runaway steer. The animal charged, and his horse stumbled, sending William tumbling into the dust. Jackson rode hard, pulling him to safety just as the steer thundered past. When the danger passed, Jackson's anger boiled over. "You think this is a game, boy?" he shouted, his voice shaking. "This ain't about glory, it's about survival. Every life out here depends on doin' the work right, not showin' off." William's pride burned, but behind his defiance lay shame. That night, Libby found him sitting alone in the barn, shoulders slumped. She sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "You've got your father's fire," she said softly. "But fire can burn if you don't learn to control it. You want to prove yourself? Then show us you can be steady, not just bold." Her words sank deeper than Jackson's anger had. William began to temper his recklessness, learning to channel his energy into skill and discipline. Slowly, he grew into a capable young man, still spirited but wiser. Meanwhile, Samuel's quiet nature blossomed into something remarkable. He began writing journals, stories, even poems about the land and the life they lived. Libby found his words tucked into books and drawers, filled with insights that revealed a soul wise beyond his years. She encouraged him, telling him that his voice was as powerful as any doctor's or rancher's. Through it all, Jackson and Libby held fast to each other. Their love, tested in countless ways, remained unshaken. They were partners not only in ranching but in parenting, in community, in life itself. One evening, after a long day, they sat together on the porch, watching the horizon glow with the last light of sunset. Jackson took Libby's hand, as he had so many times before. "Do you ever think back," he asked, "to that night at the station?" "All the time," she replied with a smile. "It feels like a lifetime ago, and yesterday all at once." He nodded. "If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't seen you." She squeezed his hand. "You would have. Somehow, some way, our paths would have crossed. Some things are meant to be." The crickets sang, the stars began to pierce the darkening sky, and for a long while they simply sat in the stillness, knowing that whatever the years brought, they had already lived a love story worthy of the ages. The seasons turned, as they always did, bringing both beauty and burden to the Double T. By the time Clara completed her first year in Chicago, the ranch was thriving once more. Letters arrived often, filled with her careful handwriting, recounting her studies, her excitement at surgeries observed, her longing for home. Each letter was read aloud at the supper table, with William teasing about the big city doctor, and Samuel quietly pocketing phrases that inspired his own writing. Libby cherished those letters most of all. She traced the words with her fingers, imagining her daughter's voice, her laughter, her determination. Jackson, too, felt a swell of pride each time he read her progress, though his heart ached with the distance. He was a man of land and cattle, but even he knew his daughter's future was larger than Wyoming's wide skies. William, now nearly grown, began to take on more of the ranch's responsibilities. He rode with Jackson daily, learning the intricacies of breeding, grazing, and trade. Though his fiery nature still flickered, maturity had tempered it. He carried himself with more steadiness, more purpose, his eyes set on the ranch's future. Samuel, meanwhile, continued to grow in quiet brilliance. His notebooks filled with stories of the land, the people, the struggles and triumphs he observed. Libby often told him that one day the world would read his words, and though he blushed at the thought, a part of him believed her. But as peace settled over the Double T, life, in its way, prepared a new storm. It began with whispers of drought once more. The rains that had sustained the valley in previous years failed to come. By midsummer, the grass was brittle, the rivers thin. Jackson rode far and wide in search of pasture, but each valley seemed drier than the last. The cattle grew lean, and with them, so did the ranch's prospects. The strain weighed heavily on Jackson. At night, when the house was quiet, he sat at the table with ledgers spread before him, his brow furrowed, his hands rubbing at tired eyes. Libby would place a gentle hand on his shoulder, urging him to rest, but he always shook his head. "Not yet," he'd whisper. "Not while there's still more I can do." One evening, William found him there and sat across the table. "Papa, let me take some of this burden. You've carried it long enough." Jackson studied his son, seeing not the reckless boy he once was but a young man ready to shoulder the weight of legacy. Slowly, he nodded. "Maybe it's time you did." Together, father and son worked tirelessly, driving the herds to distant grazing lands, bargaining with neighbors, rationing supplies. It was a battle fought inch by inch, but they refused to yield. During those long, dry months, Libby held the heart of the ranch together. She kept the hands fed, the children steady, the spirit of the place unbroken. To her, drought was not only a test of the land but of the soul. And though she grew weary, she never faltered. Yet fate had another trial in store. One late summer afternoon, a storm gathered on the horizon. Thunder rolled, lightning split the sky, and rain finally poured down in torrents. Relief swept across the valley, until the lightning struck. Flames leapt from the dry grass, fed by wind and heat. Within minutes, fire roared toward the ranch. Panic erupted as men scrambled to save what they could. Jackson and William mounted their horses, racing to drive the herds away from the inferno. Libby gathered Samuel and the youngest hands, organizing a desperate defense around the house and barns. The firestorm was unlike anything they had faced. Walls of flame devoured pastures, fences collapsed into ash, smoke choked the air. Horses screamed, cattle bawled, men shouted above the roar. In the chaos, Samuel was nearly trapped in the barn. A burning beam fell, blocking his path. Libby, without hesitation, rushed through the smoke, dragging him to safety. Her skirts caught fire, but Jackson, arriving just in time, smothered the flames with his coat, his face pale with terror. All night they fought, and by dawn, the fire was beaten back. The Double T stood, scarred, blackened, but standing. When the smoke cleared, the family gathered on the porch, exhausted and shaken. William's arm was burned, Jackson's hands blistered, Libby's hair singed. Samuel clung to his mother, eyes wide with the memory of flame. Jackson looked at his wife, his voice rough. "You nearly died in there." Libby met his gaze, steady despite her weariness. "So did he. And I'd do it again, Jackson. For any of them." He pulled her close, his voice breaking. "I couldn't bear to lose you." "You won't," she whispered, though in her heart she knew such promises were fragile. In the days that followed, the ranch rallied. Neighbors came with tools and hands, rebuilding fences, sharing supplies. Clara returned briefly from Chicago when she heard of the fire, her presence a balm to the family. She marveled at the resilience of her parents, at the way they turned ruin into renewal. "Every time life tries to break you," she said softly to Libby one evening, "you rise stronger. How do you do it?" Libby smiled faintly. "Because I have your father. Because we have each other. That's the only way." Clara carried those words with her when she returned to Chicago, knowing they were not just her mother's secret but the foundation of the Thornton legacy. For months, the scars of the fire remained, a blackened pasture, a rebuilt barn, burned hands that healed slowly. But the ranch endured, as it always had. And with each trial survived, their story grew larger, whispered across the territory, told around campfires, printed in papers. The tale of the millionaire cowboy and the nurse he found in the snow had become more than a love story. It had become a testament to endurance, to partnership, to the unbreakable bond of two souls who faced the West together and refused to yield. The fire had left its scars, but the Double T breathed again. Pastures slowly returned to green, the cattle grew strong, and the ranch hands, though weary, carried pride in what they had saved. Life on the frontier always demanded a price, but it also rewarded those who refused to bow to hardship. Libby, though, carried quiet aches that did not heal as quickly as burned barns and blistered hands. The smoke she had breathed during the fire left her with a lingering cough. Some days it was no more than a tickle, but others it racked her chest until her body shook. Jackson watched her closely, his worry deepening each time he heard the rasp in her breath. "Don't fuss over me," she would say with a soft smile. "I've weathered worse." But at night, when she thought he slept, she pressed a hand to her chest, eyes closed, as though steadying herself against some unseen weight. The children noticed too. Samuel grew especially protective, always hovering near, ready to fetch water or carry baskets. William took over more ranch duties, sparing her tasks he knew would strain her. Clara, writing from Chicago, filled her letters with remedies she had learned, suggestions to ease her mother's cough. Libby accepted their care with grace, but she never allowed it to overshadow her role. She continued tending the infirmary, teaching at the school, guiding the ranch with Jackson. If anything, the fragility of her health deepened her resolve. "Every day is a gift," she often told them. "And I intend to spend mine wisely." Jackson admired her strength, but in his heart, fear gnawed. He had built his life on endurance, on facing storms head-on, but this was a storm he could not rope or drive away. At night, he held her hand as she slept, silently praying that time would be merciful. The years passed, each one both a triumph and a theft. Clara graduated from medical school, returning home with the title of Dr. Thornton. Pride shone in her parents' eyes as she set up her practice in the valley, carrying forward her mother's legacy. William, strong and capable, began managing much of the ranch alongside his father. Samuel's writings, once private, found their way into local newspapers, his words capturing the rugged beauty and hardships of frontier life. Through it all, Libby remained their anchor. Though her strength waned, her spirit never dimmed. She watched her children flourish, her husband lead, her community thrive, and she knew her life had been more than she had ever dared to dream on that frozen night at the train station. But time, relentless as the Wyoming wind, could not be denied. One winter evening, as snow fell gently outside, Libby sat by the fire, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Jackson sat beside her, his hand holding hers. Their children were near, Clara reading aloud from one of Samuel's stories, William carving a piece of wood, Samuel quietly scribbling notes. The house was warm, filled with love. Libby looked around, her eyes shining. "This," she whispered, "is everything I ever wanted." Jackson squeezed her hand, his throat too tight for words. In the weeks that followed, her strength faded further. The cough deepened, her steps slowed, her nights grew restless. The family rallied around her, each one carrying a part of her burden. Jackson rarely left her side, his rough hands gentle as he tended to her needs. One night, when the moon hung full and silver over the valley, Libby asked to be taken to the ridge where Jackson had first proposed. Wrapped in blankets, she was lifted into a wagon, and Jackson drove her slowly up the hill. The children followed on horseback, silent, solemn. At the top, the valley stretched before them, moonlight glinting off the river, the ranch below glowing faintly in the dark. Libby breathed deeply, her eyes drinking in the sight. "This land," she whispered, "it's been our home, our trial, our triumph. And you, Jackson, you've been my heart through it all." Jackson's eyes glistened as he held her close. "And you've been mine, Libby. From the moment I found you, I knew. You were my destiny." She rested her head against his chest, her voice soft. "Promise me you'll keep going. For the children. For the ranch. For us." His voice broke as he whispered, "I promise." That night, back at the house, with her family gathered around, Libby slipped quietly from this world. Her passing was gentle, her hand in Jackson's, her children's voices whispering words of love. Grief fell heavy on the double T, but so did gratitude. They buried her on the hill overlooking the valley, beneath the great oak where vows had once been spoken. The whole community gathered, their faces wet with tears, their voices lifting hymns into the cold air. Jackson stood by her grave long after the others had gone, his hat in his hands, his heart heavy. "You gave me everything," he whispered. "And I'll carry it, till my last breath." Life without Libby was harder than any trial he had faced, but Jackson endured. He poured himself into the ranch, into his children, into the legacy they had built together. Clara tended the sick with her mother's compassion. William led the ranch with his father's fire. Samuel wrote the stories that would carry their family's history into the future. And always, in the heart of it all, was Libby, the nurse found in the snow, the woman who had healed not only bodies but souls, who had turned a wealthy cowboy's fortune into something greater, a life of love, sacrifice, and meaning. As the years rolled on, her story and Jackson's became more than family memory. It became history, told and retold, a tale of love that endured beyond hardship, beyond time itself. And whenever travelers passed through the valley and asked about the great ranch, the locals would smile and say, "Ah, that's the Double T. That's where the millionaire cowboy found his nurse. That's where they built a love story that made history." In the years after Libby's passing, Jackson carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had known great love and great loss. His shoulders were still broad, his hands still calloused from work, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He walked the ranch with steady steps, but his gaze often drifted toward the ridge, to the oak tree where she rested. Each morning, before the sun rose, he visited her grave. He spoke little, but his silence was a kind of prayer, his presence a vow kept. Sometimes he told her of the cattle, the seasons, the children. Other times he simply stood, hat in hand, the wind carrying his thoughts to where words could not reach. The children drew strength from him, just as he drew strength from them. Clara, now a doctor in her own right, returned often to the ranch between her duties in town. She tended the sick with skill and compassion, but she also tended her father's heart. She saw the way his hands lingered on her mother's belongings, the way his breath caught when he caught a glimpse of Samuel's riding or William's stride, reminders of Libby in their every movement. William became the backbone of the ranch. His boldness had grown into leadership, his fire tempered by the lessons of hardship. Under his care, the herds flourished again, the pastures thrived, and the Double T grew stronger than ever. Men respected him not only for his skill but for his fairness, the same quality that had defined his father. Yet William never forgot the voice of his mother telling him that true strength was steady, not reckless. Samuel's words, once private scribbles in notebooks, began to spread far beyond Wyoming. Local newspapers published his stories, then regional ones, until finally they found their way into books. He wrote not only of cattle and cowboys, but of the human heart, the quiet courage of mothers, the endurance of families, the unbreakable bonds of love. Readers whispered that his tales carried truth sharper than fact, and many recognized the shadows of his own family in every page. Through them all, Libby's presence endured. Her laughter echoed in Clara's care, her fire burned in William's determination, her soul whispered in Samuel's words. Even in her absence, she was everywhere. Jackson aged, but he never grew bitter. He carried his grief not as a weight to drag him down, but as a reminder of how deeply he had loved. When neighbors spoke of loss, he would nod, eyes soft, and say, "It don't hurt less with time, but it changes. You stop feelin' like it's takin' from you, and you start realizin' how much was given." The valley changed, too. Railroads came, towns grew, technology crept into the frontier. But the Double T remained steadfast, a symbol of resilience. Travelers still asked about it, and old-timers still told the story of the millionaire cowboy and the nurse. One autumn, years after Libby's passing, Samuel invited his father to hear him speak at a gathering in Cheyenne. Samuel stood before a hall filled with people, reading from his newest book. His voice carried steady and clear as he spoke of a woman found freezing at a train station, of a cowboy who gave her shelter, of the love that grew between them. He told of storms and fire, of sickness and sacrifice, of a bond that shaped not only a family but a community. Jackson sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his heart swelling with every word. When Samuel finished, the crowd rose in applause, but Jackson's eyes were fixed on his son, pride radiating brighter than any cheer. Afterward, Samuel placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "I only told the truth," he said quietly. "Your truth. Mama's truth. Our truth." Jackson's voice was thick as he replied, "And you've made sure it won't ever be forgotten." As the years dwindled, Jackson spent more time near the oak tree on the ridge. He would sit for hours, watching the land stretch out before him, the ranch thriving, his children grown, his grandchildren laughing in the fields. He saw in them the future, strong, enduring, full of the same fire and compassion that had once drawn him to a shivering nurse on a train platform. On his final day, Jackson was found there beneath the oak, hat in his lap, eyes closed as though in sleep. The valley mourned, but they also celebrated, for he had lived a life of purpose, of partnership, of love that had defied time and hardship. He was laid to rest beside Libby, their graves side by side, overlooking the land they had built together. And from that ridge, the double T stretched strong and unbroken, a testament not to wealth or cattle, but to a love story that truly made history. Travelers still come, even now, to stand at that ridge. They whisper of the cowboy and the nurse, of fire and snow, of children and legacy. And the wind carries those whispers across the plains, weaving them into the song of the West. Because some stories are not just told. They are lived, remembered, and passed down, forever.